Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's 7 o'clock and I'd like to welcome you all to the April meeting of the MelbPC user group. My name's Peter Bacon and I'll be your MC for tonight. We've got quite a few members in the audience here. So is anyone here for the first time? Any members here for the first time? Any visitors? No, you're all old members. Well, welcome. I'd like to welcome you and the ones that are at home. So our program tonight is the usual. First up, we'll have our guest speaker, Associate Professor Richard Beare. After Richard's presentation, we'll have a short interlude where members present will have the opportunity to fraternise and enjoy some nibbles, whilst those of you at home can have a break and enjoy a coffee or something stronger should you wish. Following the break, for those present, we'll draw the raffle, after which our President, Hugh McDonald, will give his report. Then we'll have an iHelp representative to speak on the latest from iHelp and maybe answer a few of your problems. After the meeting, we'll leave the Zoom open for a while so those of you at home can have a bit of a chat amongst yourselves, whilst the members attending here will adjourn to Fong's Chinese restaurant for the waffle sig. So just the usual few procedures for those of you at home. Make sure your microphones are turned off so we don't hear, the music or the phone ringing in the background. And just to remember that this meeting is being recorded and so will go out on the World Wide Web for everyone to see. And during the meeting, Richard said he's quite happy to take questions. So if you're in the audience, I'll give you a microphone and to ask your question. For those of you at home, just use the hands up icon, which is in the reactions part of on the bottom of your screen. I'm not sure what it is for an iPad, but for these Windows people. So just put your hand up and we'll acknowledge you and get you to ask your question. So now I'd like to introduce Associate Professor Richard Beare. Richard is the technical lead for the National Centre for Healthy Aging Data Platform Project, Senior Research Fellow working in the Peninsula Clinical School, Central Clinical School, Monash University, and Principal Research Fellow at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute, where he works with the Developmental Imaging Group. Richard is a research engineer with many years of experience delivering computational solutions to medical research problems. Richard was one of the researchers responsible for designing the NCHA Health Research Data Platform, which will underpin the centre's research and traditional activities. Richard's work focuses on using he'll tell you what it is, tools to enhance medical research and clinical practice. Examples include using natural language processing to make hospital text records useful for research purposes, geospatial modelling for planning health services, delivery and MRI in clinical studies, neurosurgery and clinical trials. So thank you, Richard. Over to you.
Thank you. Sorry, that looked short when I wrote it, but now it sounded very long now. And first thing you notice about all sorts of research and medicine in general, there are lots and lots of acronyms. Okay, so I'll just kick straight off and give you a bit of an outline. So first two parts of this talk are going to be about what healthy longevity actually is. So it's a bit philosophical and kind of not my area of expertise, but it's been drummed into us a bit lately. So I'll try and describe to how the sort of research community and medical community is thinking about that. Then I'll give you a little bit of an overview of the NCHA data platform and some of the activities that are happening down at Monash and Peninsula Health at Frankston. And then the next two things I'm going to talk about are some older examples of how some of the computational work that we do at Monash Uni and at Murdoch Children's have led to changes in healthcare. So examples of real translation of research effort into practice. Now, having looked at a couple of the other recordings on the web, there's always an About Me section. So I'll try and keep that short. So my undergraduate was electrical engineering and science with majors in physics and computer science, and that was a really long time ago. I did postgrad in electrical engineering. This is all in Adelaide, with a group who was looking at modeling of insect visual systems in order to build sensors. So that's kind of smart sensors type stuff. And from there, I moved to Sydney, where I was with the image analysis group for 7 and a bit years. And then needing to move to Melbourne, I sort of fell into academia and the Monash neurosciences group. That later evolved into the stroke and aging group. This is all based at Monash Medical Centre, just down the road from the Clayton campus at Monash. And about 15 years ago, the funding was running out and ended up splitting my role into 2. So I've had 2 jobs for the last 15 years or so, one with Monash and one with Murdoch Children's. And that Monash role has evolved into this new role at the National Centre for Healthy Aging down at Peninsula. Oh, sorry, a bit far away. Okay, sorry about that, everyone. That was a boring bit anyway. Now, and also based on what Kirsten was quizzing me about when I first talked to her, I should list all the languages and platforms that I use. So I use Linux for pretty much all the scientific work, and that's both workstations and high-performance computing clusters. And in case you're wondering, HPC clusters in general are collections of Linux servers connected together with high-speed networks and maybe with fancy graphics, general purpose graphics units on them, so GPUs. Use C and C++ for most of the image analysis I work with, and that's with a toolkit called RTK. It's an international open source thing used for medical image processing. Do an awful lot of Bash for building workflows of all sorts. R is my go-to for any kind of data analysis, stats and visualization. I've been using that for a long time since I started at CSIRO. Even before version 1 of R, as it happens. Uses Python a fair bit, and there's a lot of Java and JavaScript in my future, I suspect. All right, so now on to the real philosophical part, healthy aging. Now this, believe it or not, is a kind of new-ish area in the official research and medical community. The World Health Organization only published a baseline report a few years back and has earmarked the decade 2021 to 2030 as the decade of healthy aging. And you won't be surprised to learn that the thinking about what this all means is very complicated. But I'm sure we all appreciate it. It's really, really important because people are living longer. And the quote from their report is that adding more years to life can be a mixed blessing if it's not accompanied by adding more life to years. And so the whole premise about thinking about healthy aging and healthy longevity is to achieve that adding more life to years part. And so the World Health Organization's report is really building everything around a couple of core ideas. And one of those is this idea of functional ability. They have 5 basic parts to that. The first is the ability to meet one's basic needs, the ability to learn, grow, and make decisions, mobility, ability to build and maintain relationships, and the ability to contribute. And for them, the goal of the decade of healthy aging is to maximize older people's functional ability. So this is all a framework of how to think about what healthy aging actually means. And for them, functional ability combines this idea of intrinsic capacity, so what the person is capable of without any external help, the environment, so what's going on around them, and how they interact with the environment, because there may be a whole lot of help available in the environment, but if people don't use it, then there's something wrong with the setup. And so what that collectively means is that if we achieve, so in order to achieve healthy aging, we need to maintain our functional ability. And of course, what does that actually mean? Their definition, and it seems like a reasonable one to me, is that functional ability enables people to do and be what they have reason to value. And so this is where we get into some of the philosophical parts of how healthy aging might be different to what we traditionally think of as health. And one of the visitors we had from the author of this report a few weeks back was giving the example of, if you see an older person with 6 chronic diseases, are they healthy or not? And first thought, well, no, of course they can't be because they've got 6 chronic diseases. But if that same person is attending the Masters game and winning the 100-meter race for their age category, are they still healthy? And probably yes, they do. If they value that 100 meters and they're winning it, then probably yes, they are healthy. And so that is something that actually happens. Right? Apparently some of the people in the Masters games had several chronic diseases that were carefully managed, yet won the 100 meters for their age category. So means it's quite a complex thing to think about. Now, yes, so this idea is that, so the idea behind the report is to think of ways that we can minimize the gap, yes, the gap at the top right of this graph. So this gap is, the orange area is the expanding gap between our capability and what we need to achieve that might increase as we get older. And by minimizing that, we are hopefully helping people age healthily. And there are lots of different ways you might help minimize that gap. And depending on what the method you use is, they may come into play at different times in a person's life. So early education and healthy lifestyle stuff happens much earlier. It has a much longer term effect compared to more acute management of diseases. All right, so that's a lightning overview of a really complex report that's put together by a lot of very clever people. But what does this kind of thing mean for medical research and health services? So I'll just jump into that in a little bit, in a brief way. Now, we're all experts on randomized controlled trials now because we have had them drummed into us over lockdowns about all the vaccine trials. So what we typically do in a randomized controlled trial, which is still considered the gold standard for collecting evidence about anything medical, is get two groups of people, ideally as absolutely identical as possible. And then we do something slightly different to each group. So we give some of them a medication and some of them something that looks like a medication, so a placebo. And then we try and measure some really hard outcome. So in the COVID cases, that would be, did they get COVID or not? And in fact, even in quite simple sounding trials, it's really quite complex because in the COVID case, it was, did they get COVID? How serious was it? Did they go to hospital? Did they die, etc.? And that was a trial taking place out in the community. So it was really, there were a lot of factors to manage. These factors become much harder to manage as we deal with more complex groups. So if our group really looks like this, where everyone is different, then it's much harder to structure a sensible trial. And on top of that, if we're thinking about aging populations where everyone already typically has multiple conditions to worry about, then any effect that we expect to find with the medication tends to get diluted. So if we have a medication that has a significant looking effect in a younger population, that effect on an older population tends to be reduced because there are other things going on in their lives. So what the suggestion from the World Health Organization is that researchers like us need to think about new kinds of outcome measures. So for example, rather than one or two very easily measured outcome measures, we might need to look at more frequent measures of things that people value. So if we take that picture as an example and look at the hand, that's a very arthritic hand. So we can imagine a kind of trial that's looking at some treatment for arthritis. And maybe you've got a drug that changes the pain or the swelling and makes the hand slightly more mobile. And if you're only measuring the hand, then that might give you a successful trial in a test population. But the people who are in that test population may not actually care about that small decrease in pain or swelling if it doesn't affect their lives. So if we pull back and look at the person, what they're actually worried about in this picture is being able to button a coat. So measuring pain is a traditional kind of measure that we might use for a drug trial, but it's not actually something that the people in the trial value. They value how it changes their lives. So how do we think about measuring that kind of thing and how do we incorporate it into trials? And that's a really challenging problem when everyone values something different. But that's the sort of thing we need to come up with a solution to. And if I show this in a very cartoonish way, so imagine we've got a set of data that we obtain from a trial. So we measure everyone once, and let's imagine that's on the x-axis, this is age, and on the y-axis, it's something we're measuring about the person, but a nice simple measure that we do once or twice during the trial. And if we look at that trial, it looks like everyone's getting worse with age. So no surprise, we don't learn anything useful from that. But if we can take lots of measures about each individual and group them together, then maybe we're seeing that our intervention, whatever this happens to be, is keeping those people stable or maybe even improving their lives a bit. And so with this kind of measure, we can begin to think about different kinds of intervention and different kinds of outcome. And if we can come up with ways of measuring people more often about things they actually care about, then we can develop trials that address this problem of healthy aging. Okay, so that's the broad brushstroke of what this means for medical research. We need to restructure trials, get different types of outcome measures, which is all a long process because people who fund trials are used to funding trials with a certain type of outcome measure that you can actually go and measure a pain threshold, measure something very hard. They're not used to funding trials that have this more qualitative type of outcome measure. Now, what does this mean for health services? So this is also something we've had drummed into us over COVID, and there's been a lot of publicity about it lately, that health services probably need to begin changing their models of care. So what's traditionally happened, and this basically arose post-World War II, so a person gets sick, attends a health service, gets treated, health service gets paid. Simple as that. It's all about acute treatment, not prevention, not something about keeping people active in the community, nothing like that. It's all about the very acute services, and all the funding models are designed to support that. So in the health services jargon, what we're talking about here is new models of care. So there is a pressure from government and community to figure out how health services can deliver these new models of care, how they should be designed, who should design them, how they should be funded. And this is the space that the NCHA, the National Centre for Healthy Aging, operates in. So we're about collecting some of the data from the health service side that will help support this kind of work. So questions so far? This is the broad brushstroke of the space we're operating in. I can elaborate if I haven't been clear on something. All right. So National Centre for Healthy Aging. So this is a partnership between Monash Uni and Peninsula Health. And our goal is to develop data and build infrastructure to support the creation and testing of new and innovative models of care. So those sorts of things I just mentioned, which are based around patient-centered care or value-based care. I'll go into those in a little bit more detail later. We have a focus on aging and aged care, mental health and addiction. And we have partnerships with industry, local communities, and the aged care sector. And this is my overseas slide, so I don't think anyone here will need much location information, but we're obviously based near Melbourne, and we're based in the Mornington Peninsula. And so I've already heard that a few people have made the drive up, but I'll give a bit of an overview as to why this is a good spot to put the National Centre for Healthy Aging. So first up, it is a peninsula. That tends to mean a very stable population, and a large portion of that population do source their healthcare needs from Peninsula Health, which is the only public provider serving that area. We have a large elderly population and also the highest rates of dementia in Australia. And we've got a broad demographic in terms of socioeconomic status. So there's some of the wealthiest suburbs in Melbourne and also some of the most disadvantaged. And we have a suburban and rural split. So there's some very rural zones on the peninsula and some very suburban zones. So Peninsula Health catchment that you can see in colour there goes up to about Seaford, across to Cranbourne in the other direction, as well as right down to the bottom of the Point and the Pen. And sorry? No, not quite. So Seaford's about the cut-off on the Pen Highway. Yeah. And sorry, I should have said this earlier, we've been funded by a Commonwealth grant to do this work. And the people, so the lead of this, I should have put photos up. I thought I didn't get around to asking him about that. So the lead of the project is Professor Belendra Srikanth, who I've worked with for a very long time. He's a clinical scientist and a researcher and professor of medicine at Peninsula Health. Within the data platform, which is one of the projects within the National Centre for Healthy Aging, the research lead is Associate Professor Nadine Andrew, who is an epidemiologist and expert in data linkage, and I'm the technical lead. All right, so look a bit at the structure. Sorry if this is a bit too corporate. We can dive into the more exciting bits later. Basically 3 parts to the NCHA work. There's a Living Labs stream, which is basically a funding stream for projects that use the other data from the other 2 streams, as well as external data sources. The Healthy Aging Data Platform, which I'm associated with, and the Advanced Simulation Environments, which is doing a mix of things like putting new types of sensors in hospital wards, intergenerational playgrounds, that kind of stuff. So yeah, so that's the one I'm involved with. All right, and finally, spit out the place. Sorry about this. Oh yes, okay. Dive into the data platform details. So to stay up front, we're very aware of the needs for governance and security of this data. We operate in what's called the 5 safe frameworks. All the data that we work on stays in the hospital system while it's identifiable, and the de-identified data that we do release to researchers only goes to secure environments. Okay, so what is it all? Basically, the data platform is a data warehouse. So I don't know how many are familiar with this kind of terminology, but databases of various kinds sit in all sorts of systems. So every sort of company which deals with customers will have some sort of database. Those databases are structured to deal with one particular problem in general. So it might be a transaction processing database if people are buying products. In the hospital, those databases are designed to support a clinician interacting with a patient, or possibly manage radiology or pathology or pharmacy. Databases that serve operational purposes aren't generally structured in a way that makes them easy to use their data for research or for other kinds of analysis. And so what people generally do is take the data from those databases, restructure it, maybe transform it, clean it a bit, and put it into another database that they call their data warehouse. And that warehouse is structured to allow people to do analysis of that data more easily. So that's what we're doing. Now, health service data products are really, really complex. For a start, there's lots of them. So just dealing with patients, we've identified in Peninsula Health 11 different data systems that we want to get data from. And they range from the main sort of electronic medical record system that you'll get, you interact with if you go in through emergency or inpatient services, through to community health has a different one. There's patient management systems that control information about where a patient is in the hospital, and finance systems as well, all of which are important. And we're attempting to gather that data together and put it into a form that makes it easier to access for researchers. Now, traditionally, that has been really hard for researchers to do for a whole heap of reasons. But they broadly come down to the problem that people in IT services in the hospital aren't there to service research. They're there to keep the hospital running, and they're really busy. So if you trot into their office and you're an outsider asking for data, even if you're an insider asking for data, they rarely have time to answer many of those requests. And so that means that there's very little analysis done with this kind of data, and we're hoping to change that. What people have done in the past, instead of using hospital data, is use what's called the statutory data. And that is data that hospitals submit to government. So because we're in this centrally funded model, hospitals need to provide some record of what they've done to the government, and they do that by a process called coding. So every time someone visits a hospital, gets admitted, goes through care, and then gets discharged, those notes are reviewed by specialist people sitting down in the basement who code it and say what happened to this patient. And that gets submitted to various government organisations who then say, well, this is how much money you get. And so that data that government holds has traditionally been used for a lot of research purposes, especially about policy. So if you want to change policy or investigate the changes of, say, a drug policy or a prescription policy on the community, then that's the sort of place you go to get your data. But we know there are limitations to that because it is collected for funding purposes. It's not collected for research purposes. So there are certain questions you can't answer with it. And there's certain things you can't find out. So for example, if you get the emergency coded data, you probably can't tell who came in who was homeless or what sort of drug overdose people had, because that sort of thing isn't reported typically. So this, by having access to the raw electronic medical record, we hope to be able to answer those sort of questions in more detail. And what we've tried to do is create a set of core variables that we think most people use. So we went through a process of interviewing and having panels of experts who might use this data, select a set of variables that they thought they would use regularly in research. And we aim to be able to extract that really quickly for a given set of people so that research can proceed efficiently. And yes, the person leading this work is Tanya Party. And sorry, my focus on this is looking at the clinical notes. So I mentioned there's a lot of structured data in these databases, so things like temperatures, dates of birth, so on. Also a lot of written stuff, which is what the human coders use to produce their codes that get sent off to government. We're hoping that those clinical notes will form a useful research resource in the future as well, because we can effectively recode to answer a specific question retrospectively. All right, the other main body of work, or one of the other main bodies of work, is an area called patient-reported outcomes, or PROMs. So I mentioned earlier on value-based care, where rather than looking at hard outcomes that are easy to measure, we evaluate care programs based on what the patients say they like. So the patients value. So this is the broad idea of value-based care or patient-centered care. And this is something that policymakers have been trying to make happen for a long time, but no one really knows how to do it. One of the things that is key to making that happen is regular feedback from the patient through things like PROMs. So we're hoping to create a health service-wide PROM that is quick and easy to fill in, and therefore a lot of people will actually fill in and make it a useful resource for evaluating how effective changes in health service delivery have been. For anyone's information who's interested, PROMs are actually quite widely used in specialist medical areas. So there are a lot of PROMs used in, say, cancer treatment, that kind of area, where the treatment is quite complex and there's lots of nasty side effects, and PROMs are a way of evaluating the trade-off between effectiveness of the treatment and the nastiness of the side effects. But those PROMs are very long, very specific to the thing that's wrong with you, and so therefore don't apply to a broad section of the community who don't have that disorder. Here we're looking at what I call quality of life PROMs, which can be kept very simple and therefore applicable to a lot of different people. And finally, community engagement. So we're very conscious that this data has come from the community. So we like to get the community's involvement in all sorts of levels of operation of the platform. And this is where some of you here tonight might be interested in getting involved. So this ranges from things like being on committees to evaluate proposals to use the data, looking at what might be considered acceptable uses of the data by researchers and the health service, maybe to set research direction. So if you as a community member have a question you think is relevant to the health service and want it answered, that's another thing that you may put forward. So as part of that work, and something to keep an eye on in the next few months, we are deploying a platform called Voice, which comes from, unfortunately named, comes from the Uni of Newcastle in UK. And it's kind of a matchmaking service between community members who are interested in research and researchers. So the idea is you sign up to it, punch away, enter some areas of interest, and you get potentially matched with research opportunities. So for example, a researcher might say, look, I want some input on this kind of topic. And if that's one of your areas of interest, you might get linked with that researcher and be able to participate in workshops that design that research program. Or they might be looking for people to fill in surveys about a certain topic. So it's a matchmaking service between researchers and people who are interested in medical research in the community. So that's coming within the next few months. So I'll let you know when it's deployed, so you can have a look. So anyone who's interested in being involved, Kim is the contact. And so get in touch with her if you have any questions and think that you might be able to contribute some time. Okay, so that's the end of the part about the NCHA. Should I expand on any parts of that before I go into the more translational examples? Questions come at the end? Yeah, you have a question? Yeah. Oh.
Thank you. That was great. And also, do you think there's a push to get the generations involved with each other, like the old people's home for 4-year-olds and the teenagers and so on?
It's certainly seen as an interesting option, yeah. So we've got this intergenerational playground on the drawing board. So that's something that's happening at Belvedere Park, which is where St Kilda has their home, one of their bases. There's also a related one at Hampton and somewhere else in Melbourne. So there's that kind of thing, trying to be evaluated. So that's considered especially interesting for people with dementia as a way of keeping them mobile and so on. So there are a few things like that. They definitely raised a lot of interest. What the next step is, I don't know. But yeah, those programs about childcare and aged care mixing and all that sort of thing have raised lots of questions, and people are really interested in them. I don't know of one happening at Peninsula, but you never know. But yeah, the playgrounds are happening.
And the second question I had is, I've heard in America, and maybe here too, there's a lot of problems in that the medical services are siloed. So there's, you know, there's a charge for each service. So therefore you just stack up the services.
Yeah, all sorts of ways. So that's, I guess you could consider that the disconnect between acute services and what the patient wants. So especially if you have a lot of chronic diseases, you end up seeing lots of different professionals, don't really talk to each other, lots of different clinicians, they don't really talk to each other. So you're jumping from one to the other, asking the same question lots of times, maybe giving the same answer lots of times, but there's less crossover. Yeah, there's no easy answer to that. They have different referral systems, and there's all sorts of historical infrastructure that makes that very tricky. The PROMs could kind of help if they can all see the results. So that's one thing that we think might help a bit if we have a broad PROM collection and all the layers of clinical service, so acute in the hospital down to outpatient, down to community care, can see the same PROM. At least if you move within the health service between those different layers of care, you may, at least then they'll be able to share the patient view of themselves, which will be something. But at the moment they're on different systems, so they can't, if you're on community health, that community health professional can't see what happened to you in hospital. So there's all that silo, there's lots of different levels of silo. The one exception, I guess, is that I know of, and I'm not an expert on this, but in the US, big insurance companies have integrated care, but that's for a different reason.
Richard, when you're looking for people that I gather the public that might assist, do you follow up on people that have had major surgery 10, 20 years ago? Are you interested in that sort of thing, or just current medical?
It depends. So I guess that will depend on the research question. So if it's something that there are a lot of things like registries that follow up surgery, because they need to keep track of whether devices that were implanted, for example, are safe, and sometimes that takes a long time. But that'll be more what's called a registry. So that's a different type of research, if you like, a specialist research program. So there's like a stroke registry and a cardiac registry, and lots of these things in Australia that are designed to support particular types of either surgery or disorder. So it just depends. Yeah, I can imagine it could happen. I don't know if it's actually happening right this moment though. Okay, so first translational type example. So this is work that started about 2014, I think, and looking at geospatial analysis for acute stroke treatment. So a bit of the clinical background from a non-expert. This is particularly about ischemic stroke. So ischemic stroke happens when you get a blockage in the brain, so a blood clot, and it blocks an artery. And that starves the surrounding brain tissue, blood and nutrients and oxygen. And if you don't clear the clot, then that tissue will die. Now, quite a long time ago now, a treatment was established that changed what could be done with this kind of stroke. It's called TPA. I remember how that actually, let me move my microphone. Remember what that actually stands for. It's tissue plasminogen activator. So it's a drug treatment that will dissolve the clot and restore the supply. Now that's quite well established. It's been around for 20, 30 years. And lots of hospitals can do that. If the clot is much bigger, that doesn't work. So if you have a really massive clot, the TPA treatment won't dissolve it in time to help you. If it probably won't dissolve it at all. And both of these are time critical things. If you can restore blood supply by getting rid of the clot quickly enough, the brain tissue will recover. If you can't, the brain tissue will stay dead, but the longer you leave the clot in there, the more will die. Now, about 2015, a series of trials were published about a technique called endovascular clot retrieval. And what happens in ECR, endovascular clot retrieval, is when you have a big clot, and they stick a catheter in through the arteries, right up in through your brain, grab the clot and pull it out. So that's what you see on the right. So that clears the clot, super effective if it's done quickly. Now, after these trials were published, I think it was the Victorian government decided that they would fund these ECR services. But ECR is really expensive to deliver. You need a specialist part of a hospital. It needs to be dedicated in there all the time. You need a series of specialist clinicians to support that service. And those clinicians need to be doing a certain number of cases per year, or they won't keep their skills up. So that's something like 50 cases a year for the specialist. It's called the interventional radiologist. And broadly speaking, what we showed by our study, and I'll go into how we did it in a few minutes, is that we needed 2 services, and Royal Melbourne and Monash Medical Centre are the places they should be. And we could also make some estimates about how many patients those services would actually have to deal with. And we did all that using free software, census data, and web service. So I'll go through a little bit of detail of how we actually did that. So in order to answer this question, what we needed to know were how many strokes there were likely to be in a given year and where they would happen. And then on top of that, we needed to know how long it would take to get from each of the stroke locations, so the home address, to a treatment service. And we couldn't really do that using existing ambulance data, because when the ambulance picks up a patient, it only goes to one place. So you can't say, well, what would happen? How long would it have taken this ambulance to go to that other place? So we needed to create some synthetic data to answer this question. Okay, so let's look at the first bar. So the question of how many strokes and where. So this combined 2 bits of information. So there's scientific literature looking at incidence of stroke in Australia. That is quite old, so it's from 2000. But that gives you figures that let you estimate, given a population and an age range in that population, how many people per 100,000 will have a stroke in a given year. Combine that with data published by the ABS, looking at the census data, which tells you on a per postcode basis and on other area basis as well, what the breakdown of people by age and sex and some other risk factors in that postcode are. So combining those two gives you an estimate of how many people per postcode are likely to have a stroke in a given year. And we can do that, of course, for all of Australia. We focused on doing this for Greater Melbourne. So that gives us strokes per postcode. Now, to take that and produce an estimate of travel time to each hospital, what we did was just take random addresses. So if we figured out that a postcode is likely to have 10 strokes in a given year, we would just sample 10 addresses from that postcode at random. Then we took those addresses and fed them off to Google's distance API and asked, how long does it take to get from this address to each of the hospitals of interest at a different time of day? So we ended up building a data set where we had 1 row per address, and for each address, we had a travel time to a different hospital at a different time of day. And we did some validation of the Google Distance API against real hospital trips. So we pulled some ambulance data from Ambulance Victoria and checked how well the optimistic travel time that Google gives you compares to what the ambulance actually achieved. So these were ambulances who were doing lights and siren with either cardiac or stroke events and going from an address somewhere near Monash Medical Centre to Monash Medical Centre. And we found that actually Google said they should have got there a bit quicker. So Google's optimistic estimate, which basically says green lights all the way, was a bit better than even an ambulance achieved most of the time, on average in a couple of minutes. But really the estimate that Google gave us was pretty good. Anyway, from that set of data, we were able to estimate what we call a catchment basin for each hospital. We could look at different catchment basins if we made the service available in 1, 2, 3, or 4 hospitals. And with those different configurations, we could say how many people or what proportion of cases would reach the hospital within some threshold. So we were using a half-hour or 1 hour threshold, depending on what sort of model we're interested in. And that would tell us things like, if we have more hospitals, do we actually increase the proportion of people who make it to hospital in time? And I shall just try and anyway, the result of all this is that we have 2 ECR centres, one at Royal Melbourne and one at Monash Medical Centre, and that this publication we put out was contributed to that. I shall just attempt to switch screens and show you the webpage that was part of the publication. So all that data I mentioned that was obtained with Google Maps, and sorry, I need to switch this to the new screen. Sorry, here we are. Was captured in a couple of web pages. So this is our 2-hospital model. So this is the one that actually exists at the moment, but this data is from 2014 or so. We can interrogate this in a number of different ways. So if you're in the cyan area, you really want to be taken to Monash Medical Centre because that's quicker. If you're in the purple area, you want to be taken to Royal Melbourne because that's quicker. Those boundaries shift at different times of the day. So in the morning, as you can imagine, it's busy, traffic's moving that way outside COVID. So the area that Monash Medical Centre services gets a bit bigger, and you can explore that in different ways. We can ask the same question, say, what if we have 3 hospitals? So imagine if we put the same service in the Alfred. It's a bit of a waste really, because the Alfred and Royal Melbourne are basically next to each other anyway. So you don't really service more people more quickly by putting that service there. So we can answer all that kind of question with this really simple data. Let me switch back now. All right, and so that same technique we've used for a whole lot of different types of service. So that, I guess, roll back a bit. This work did actually make a contribution to how these services were deployed in Melbourne. So about 2016, 17, these things were rolled out. There initially was pressure just to do it in Royal Melbourne. But we showed that if they did that, then the number of people who could reach the service in time wasn't as good as if you had 2. So, and we've used the same kind of technique for a whole lot of health services now. So we've looked at home birth. So what sort of hospitals out there should think about introducing a home birth service, cardiac events, so STEMI, so cardiac treatment for cardiac arrest. Mobile stroke units. So there's you may have seen it, there's a large stroke ambulance, basically the size of a truck, that's based at the Royal Melbourne. It has a CT scanner in the back, so a computed tomography, 3D X-ray thing. And that gets used to try and figure out what type of stroke you've had. So if you had a bleed or a blockage, because the treatments are very different, and that can do it at your house. But there's only one of them. So how do you use it? Under what conditions do you send it out? And because if you send it to somewhere too far away, then it's actually a disadvantage. They're better off having a regular paramedic bring them to the hospital. And the way that gets deployed changes if you can allow it to deliver back to Royal Melbourne or to Monash Medical Centre. So that was the sort of question we could ask with this kind of data. And then finally, we've also done some work with a visitor from Denmark who was looking at how they should deploy their helicopter fleet that they use for picking up stroke patients in Denmark. They use both helicopters and regular ambulances, of course. And yeah, all this is done with free software. So we used R and various R packages, Google Way and ggmap. A lot of the data for display purposes is based on OpenStreetMap and libraries that talk to that, leaflet, and resources from the ABS and Australian government. So GNAF is the National Address File, which is a list of every property in Australia with coordinates. So we use that kind of thing in our sampling framework. I'm about to shift to another area now. Any questions about that one while we're on it? Okay, so this is now, I've switched jobs now. So this is now Murdoch Children's work. Now, I think it was last weekend, there's this article in one of the Herald Sun supplements. So this is a story about epilepsy, kids with epilepsy who have their epilepsy cured by brain surgery. And Dr. Alison Ray is the head of neurosurgery in the Royal Children's, and she's the one who did this surgery. Now, the work I'm about to talk about is what has led to the development of a team that does the workups for these kids. So they take them through the MRI scanner, process their data, and provide some of the recommendations on and planning for Alison's surgery. Now, some of you with really long memories may recall an episode of Catalyst about 10 or 12 years ago that covered some of the early work about this same project. Now, the team that does this is called NACIS, so Neuroscience Advanced Clinical Imaging Service, and they only started 2 years ago. And I guess I want to emphasize how long translation type work takes. This is just for a service, it's not a drug or anything like that. but it's fairly 10 or 12 years of fairly consistent grind to get from research in the lab, in our lab in the hospital, to a clinical service that's still not really very well funded. All right, so some background. MRI, magnetic resonance imaging. Now, on the left there is an MRI machine. That's our research scanner at the Royal Children's. All medical imaging machines look basically the same. They're a big donut and the patient goes in the middle, but there are several different types. So this one uses magnets. The other ones that you might hear about are CT, computed tomography, essentially looks the same. That uses X-rays, PET, which is positron emission tomography, where you're injected with radioisotopes, and those isotopes gather in different parts of your body and the location can be detected. There are machines that combine several of those modalities as well. So you get PET MRIs and PET CTs as well. And the sort of pictures we get out are on the right. Should stop this. Play that again. Oops. So this is a scan of a baby. This is what's called a T2 weighted scan. And in this one, the CSF, cerebral spinal fluid, is bright. That's the goop your brain floats in. It's not blood, it's cerebral spinal fluid. So that's appearing white. And one of the great things about MRI is that there's different ways of setting it up and you can get different sorts of information from different sorts of scans. So as I mentioned, this is a T2 one, and in a baby, there's not much contrast between the different tissues in the brain because the connections between the brain different parts of the brain haven't really been formed yet. But as you get older, we can do things like this. So this is what are called T1 scans. And in older kids and adults, you can see nice differentiation of different types of tissues. So in bright here is what's called the white matter. Dark is the gray matter. The gray matter is where all the action happens. So that's all the neurons. The white matter is what connects it together. And here's what connects it together. This one is what's an axial slice. So it's as if I've chopped off the top of my head and we're looking down on it. This one is a coronal slice of a different patient with a big tumor. So that's if you chop through this way and look from the back. Now, for the purposes of surgery, we're really interested in figuring out what the wiring of the brain is so that we don't mess it up. And everything in MRI that tells us about the wiring is based on diffusion of water. So imagine you've got water, Brownian motion in water, particles just move around at random. Now in something nice and even, like a glass of water, they move approximately the same way in each direction. But if, I'll get to the if, sorry, the thing I wanted to say first is that with diffusion weighted imaging, which is how we get our connectivity information, we're looking at a very, very low res version of the brain. So we typically look at voxels, little elements of tissue that are about 2 millimeters cubed. In each of those, there are lots and lots of water molecules. So I don't know how you say that number, but 10 to the 20, and lots of axonal fibers. So the axonal fibers are the nerve fibers that connect the different neurons together. So that's the wiring we're talking about. So each 2 millimeter cube voxel might have 40 to 80,000 fibers running through it. And we're trying to figure out what they're doing based on this one sample at 2 millimeter resolution. All right, now back to the diffusion part. If we've got fortunately for us, each voxel in the brain is not a nice glass of water. So there is structure there in the form of axons, and the water molecules don't diffuse in axons as they would in free water. So when you've got a structure like this, on the left, the water molecules tend to diffuse more rapidly along the length of the fibers than they do perpendicular to them. And MRI can be sensitized to that. So what we end up doing is taking a bunch of pictures with this sensitization set up to be in different directions. So this was established in the 90s, I guess. And that lets you make an estimate of the overall orientation of fibers in a voxel, which they capture in what's called a tensor ellipse. So this ellipse would say that in the voxel that contains this particular bit of fibers, most of the orientation is in this direction, in the long direction of the ellipse. And if you do that at every voxel and apply what's called a tractography technique, you can begin to map out tracks that connect different parts of the brain. So if we take make that estimate of the diffusion tensor imaging ellipsoid at every voxel, apply a tractography technique, then we can build this map of the tract. All right, so this was developed in the 90s. It's part of all the commercial software that's used in neurosurgery, used quite widely internationally. It wasn't not that widely used in Australia, interestingly enough. And it tells us stuff that we can't know about the brain without cutting it up. So this is the only way of getting information about the structure of the brain, especially the white matter fibers in a live brain. However, there are really well-known limitations for this technique. So imagine if we've got crossing fibers. So we've got two highways of fibers that are intersecting at about 90 degrees. So in that case, the two tensors basically average out, and we get something that's roughly circular, or spherical, has no direction at all, which means we can't track through that area. Unfortunately for us, pretty much every voxel in the brain, some estimates put it at about 90%, contain populations of fibers in different directions. So there's actually having one direction only is really rare. And this is called the crossing fiber problem. And research community's been working really hard on solving that for a long time. And the combination of advanced MRI hardware, more advanced techniques for producing the equivalent of this ellipse that support more directions in any given voxel. So this is the model that gets created as an alternative to the ellipse. And you can see that supports lots of different directions. So we can begin to interrogate crossing fibers. Combine those two things with more advanced tracking techniques, and we get better models of the same tract. So this one on the right is the source of map of the tract that we get out when we apply better acquisition. So better, newer scanner, basically, a newer algorithm, and a newer type of tractography. Now you can imagine that if you're going to surgery and the surgeon only has this to work with, where the truth is much closer to this, then there's real danger that they come. So our contribution in this neurosurgery team is that we've made this kind of advanced tractography available to the team on a routine basis. And so for things like epilepsy surgery in areas where it happen to be close to the speech areas, we can give them maps like this that are considered much more realistic than what they had before. And that can go all the way into the surgical planning system. So we do all this outside with open source software that's been produced by the research community worldwide. And we take it and put the results into the commercial system they use to navigate when they're in surgery. And so this is the sort of view the surgeon now gets. This can be brought up in this kind of VR screen, and it combines information from different types of scan. So for example, here, this orange overlay that you can see is some kind of task that they've had the person do in the MRI, like a movement task. They might be tapping their finger. And those are the bits of the brain that light up when they're tapping their finger. So the surgeon knows that those bits are working still, shouldn't go near them. And that the fibers connecting those bits of the brain to other bits of the brain shouldn't be touched either. So that's where they've got to be really careful. So this is really helpful in planning the surgery and navigating during the surgery. Same thing here. This is actually, for us, a kind of poster. Oh, and sorry, here's those planning trajectories. So sometimes the target the surgeon's trying to get to is really difficult. Might be a lot of really important brain regions next to it. And so they need really accurate maps of the connective fibers in order to find a path that's safe to go through. And so this, for us, is kind of a poster project for translation. It's actually used all the time now. Pretty much every child who comes in and is a candidate for neurosurgery gets worked up by this team. And if they do go into surgery, they'll probably have this kind of tractography done for them. And so therefore, we're really happy that it's taken our basic research work and right through into clinical practice. And kind of like much longer than I thought, sorry. Stop there. Any questions?
These scans done while the operation's in progress or beforehand?
These ones mostly before. They do actually have an interoperative scanner though. So we did do some work quite a while ago, but it's kind of slow, detailed work to create these tracks. But that is one of the things for the future. We're hoping that we'll be able to do much more real-time tractography. So especially if it's a massive tumor and the shape changes of the brain when they've pulled it out, they might often want to go back. They'd like to be able to go back and say, do a quick scan, create more tracks and say, oh, have I missed a bit? And if I have missed a bit, need to chop it out. What do I need to avoid? So yeah, the machine is there. There is one in the new children's hospitals, a thing called an IMRIS. It comes in on a big rail and they have to put all covers over the metal things so they don't fly into the scanner because they're massive magnets. But yeah, we're not doing real-time tractography. It's more structural scans and they might inject a contrast agent so they can see if some of the tumors left behind. But it does happen.
Just checking, the surgeon is provided with the scans, but he would still need to do his operation on the tissue, not with any sort of visual aid. You don't fluoresce them or anything like that.
No, so it's not fluoresced, but they have the kind of virtual reality microscope. So they've got a kind of screen that they can project these images over the images of the real brain, like some kind of video game pretty much. So it gets carefully aligned and then overlaid on a real view. So almost like it's fluoresced.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive.
Right.
And they have like trackers so that, for example, you know, the sports capture where they have markers on people's elbows and they can track with our own 3D. Have the same kind of system for instruments. So you might have a probe and you can point it at the brain, a little bit of the brain, and then a cursor will appear on screen in the corresponding position. So yeah, a lot of tools like that. They do integrate pretty closely.
So not just relying on the look of the tissue, they're really relying on a visuospatial movement guide.
And co-registration it's called. So often there's a kind of frame that they fix the head in and they register that with markers on the head so they know it's in the same place as the pre-op scan was taken. Yeah, so yeah, very careful about that kind of thing, as you can imagine. No, not yet, no. I guess that's coming, but not for neurosurgery yet. I've only seen it once, but the things I use are kind of tiny little vacuum cleaners. So it's quite a touchy, very precise instrument. Whereas the keyhole surgery that they have the robots for, I think is quite a different thing. I don't know much about that, but you've probably seen the same movies I have where the big industrial robot, turn that off? No, big industrial type robot with a manipulating one of those sort of rods that they can move right in, and it takes any shake out of a surgeon's hand and this kind of thing. They operate on a beating heart, that sort of stuff. Yeah, I haven't seen that for brain surgery. Don't think it's very widely used here yet. Oh wow! And so that.
Yeah, the other night on Channel 9 on RPA, they were using robotic surgery on the brain for putting clips in, and that stopped the surgeon from shaking hands, and it was more direct.
Yeah. So over time, yeah. So this obviously isn't the only type of brain surgery that gets done. So this is epilepsy and tumor stuff in kids. Then you've got the clips, which will be, I guess, for aneurysms and strokes and stuff. And yeah, so lots of different sorts, with all of which are very specialized, of course. Questions? I'll hand over to next. Who's next? Someone's giving reports. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Let's switch over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. Now, there's no questions from anyone at home. You all understood it, or you completely bamboozled. But just before Richard goes, no more questions? Obviously not. Well, thanks very much, Richard. I found that quite interesting, and it's handy to know how medical science and all these other things are moving. You know, the old days when you went and had your tonsils out. But just on behalf of the members, just a small thank you, and thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay, it's right on 8 o'clock, so we'll have a 15-minute break. And as I say, the members present will have a few snacks up the back, and we'll see you all at 8:15. Oh, and for those present, don't forget to buy your raffle ticket. Thank you very much for that, Choi. I'd now like to invite our President, Hugh McDonald, to come and give us the latest on what's happening with MelbPC.
Thanks, Peter. And good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone here at Moorabbin, and good evening to everyone who's out there on Zoom tonight. An awful lot happening this month. I'll just mention a couple of things. I'll talk about volunteers. So firstly, to thank, once again, everyone who volunteers each month at the club. So, we have all the volunteers here who helped put on this meeting. We have volunteers who do eye help. We have volunteers in the office. We have volunteers running SIGs and various other programs throughout the month. And so, they all put in a huge effort to, bring you everything that you get to enjoy as part of a member at MelbPC. We're always looking for new volunteers. So, if you are out there and you think you've got some free time or some interest in contributing in some way to the club, then, it would be greatly appreciated if you contacted someone on the committee or myself and or, a SIG leader, whatever, and, put yourself forward to volunteer and help out. And that's how the club continues to run and continues to thrive. So, if it does sound like something that's attractive to you, then please give it some consideration. It's good to see a few people here at Moorabbin again. I try to talk up the experience each month. We want to get as many people back, in person at Moorabbin as possible. It's a great experience. You get to, see people and catch up with people. As I mentioned in my President's report in PC Update this month, I went to the Waffle Stick last month for the very first time. So that's a fun part of the evening at Moorabbin too, to go along to Fong's Chinese restaurant. They put on a good meal. I had a chicken curry last month, which was very nice. But they've got a good range of dishes there. Wine, other drinks, whatever you want. So that's another reason to come down too. If you've never come to a monthly meeting at Moorabbin, never come to a waffle sig, maybe that's something you'd like to consider doing next month. There isn't terribly much else. So it's coming up to Easter, so I'll wish everyone a good Easter period. If you're going away, stay safe. If you're staying at home, then I hope it's a good one. And as I like to do every month, I'll see if there's any questions from anyone. Anyone here in the room got any questions they'd like to ask? No, no one at home with any questions? Okay, well, I'll keep it a nice short one for you tonight then, Peter. So thank you very much and have a good evening.
Thank you, Hugh. Now we have a representative from iHelp. I gather they're not here. They must be at home. So I'll pass over to the iHelp representative and I'll let them answer your questions and give us a report.
Thank you, Chairman. That is I today. Good evening, all. I'll open for questions in a minute, but at the moment, I thought I would pick out a theme from recent cases that iHelp has dealt with, because I suspect it's a theme that many of you have encountered, and it has to do with photographs. A member asked how he could see all his photos together. In the good old days, I guess our photos are all in the same place, or at least in the same box under the bed. But in these days of digital photos and mobile phones, we tend to accumulate photos in a number of different places. And managing photos has become a major challenge. So of course, we'd like to somehow magically ask all our photos, to do a search on all our photos together in much the way we can with certain tools do a search on all our other files together. I'm going to mention two ways of achieving this admirable goal, but I'll be more than interested to hear what other people have to offer. For us in MelbPC, the number one candidate has to be Google Photos, whether you've been using it before we moved to Google or not. If only your photos are in Google Photos, as those of you who've used it will be well aware, you can search all of those photos, and there are very powerful search tools in Google Photos when you access it through a browser. I might add that roughly the same thing holds for Apple Photos, but the primary access to that is normally on a Mac computer. The main challenge, if you're using Google Photos, is to get those other photos, including the ones that are born on your mobile phone, into Google Photos. Now, if they are born on a mobile device, it's a very simple matter to use the Google Photos app to receive automatically copies of all new photos, and when you install it, all old ones as well, from the resident photo store, which is called the gallery on an Android phone and photos in an iPhone, into Google Photos in the cloud. There's still a challenge there if you have a large number of photos that are living on your PC. There's a shortcut there. You have to upload them. I think the old backup and sync program from Google has died the death, and I don't think they're offering anything that will automatically search out photos. But you can automatically, as it were, search out photos on a PC using the search tools in Windows. And then it's a fairly short job to buffer all those into a single folder for uploading. So that's the Google Photos way in. What about the idea of having all your photos accessible to Windows Search or any other search tool that knows about photos? Of course, this is a point. That you can use from your desktop directly and not using a browser. There is well, I say obvious, it's not quite fair. It isn't obvious to everybody. You can actually do that fairly simply. What you need to get the photos from your mobile phone into a place where your computer Windows will index them is, of course, not to use Google Photos, because Windows is completely blind to what's in your Google Photos. Oddly enough, the Microsoft Photos app is blind to what's on your hard disk in the same computer. You have to you have to pull photos into it. It can't see anything until you give it something. And there are other apps like that. Okay. But the solution is to use OneDrive, because OneDrive for mobiles has a setting exactly like the one that Google Photos has, so that it can be made to get an automatic copy of all the photos coming into the phone or the tablet. The big difference here is that Windows will index your OneDrive. It can't see your Google Photos, and it's having a bit of a problem seeing your Google Drive actually these days because of the way Google set this up, but that's a quite separate story. What it can do is see your OneDrive as just another folder on your computer. So here you can use Windows search tools. You can ask the standard Windows search to find all images, all pictures on your computer, and then get a view of all of them at the same time. So that's the, by the way, I should mention that Windows search will search all mounted drives. Some people like to keep their main photo store on an external drive, especially if they have very large collections or they've got a lot of large photo files and they don't have room on their computers. That's not a problem for Windows. It will index everything on those files. It will take time the first time around, but the aim here, I'm not saying everything is going to happen overnight here. What I am saying is that there is a technique here where from a single point you can search and find all your photos. The significant difference that I'm aware of, and I'll be very interested to hear what other people have to say about this, is that Google Photos, not only Google Photos, Apple Photos does it as well. And to some extent, of course, Windows Photos does, but as I've mentioned, there's a problem there. Apple and Google have amazing sorting capacities. They will sort your photos for you. My experience of the Google face recognition is that it's pretty reliable, not quite 100%. There's a quite amusing example in our family to do with photographs of our grandson, the first grandson. And I got a number of photos of him into our system. And at a certain point, Google came back and said, are these two the same person? And it was the photos of the very young baby set against the older child. And it had kind of guessed they might be the same person, but weren't quite sure. And I think that shows me the power of their recognition system to recognize faces that have changed over time. It's not 100% successful, but it's very good. And you'll probably know also that it will automatically group photos by different categories that it's got without you needing to do it yourself, though of course you can add your own and you can add your own albums. Now, here's a question I will leave to present company. Is it easy to achieve that degree of sorting and recognition? Simply, let me say, you can certainly start with a list of all your photos visible to Windows, as it were, on a single screen. I mean, on however many 100 screens the listing might take, even in the list format in Windows. But the drawback there seems to me to be that as they're not in the same place, not even in OneDrive, which does have some facilities, does have some photo recognition facilities, you can certainly search all your photos from your desktop in that situation. But what you won't get is the power of the recognition and sorting that goes on in Apple Photos and in Google Photos. So I'll pause there now in case anyone wants to come in on this topic. And if not, I might riffle through a few other recent jobs in iHelp. Thank you. I think my sound is on, but I'm not hearing the questions.
Harry, John Thompson here. Can I jump in and say, what factors would you expect to search by?
Well, a simple, I'm not sure if you call it a factor, is, can I see all the pictures of Aunt Jane? In other words,
That implies your photos have to be titled Aunt Jane.
no, it does not in Google Photos, Johnny. Are you using Google Photos?
No.
Okay, okay. So because of the future publicity of this, I was tempted to show you my screen, but I'm not going to do it for privacy reasons. Okay, so I apologize for that. But no, in Google Photos, just have to get the right thing down. Yes. It's the Explore page, isn't it? That's right. Yes, it is. So I'm looking at Google Photos on my other screen, and as I apologize for having to hide it from you, Google Photos has a fairly familiar format. The interface has a fairly familiar format with a list of headings on the left. It's, you know, it's almost a universal format. The second item, Photos itself is everything. So you have a not quite unstructured list of all your photos. It's structured by default by dates, but they've gone and chosen some things to throw at you at the top. I mean, I've got one, well, never mind what that is at the moment. Number 2 is Explore, and it gives pride of place to images that are in little circles titled People and Pets. Now, my Google Photos hasn't found any pets, but it's found 99 people. I have 10,000 images. It's found 99 people. With the one case I mentioned apart, the grandchild, I have done nothing at all to group those. It's been done by Google. So I haven't remotely finished the job, but I've gone in and named a single image from that collection. I was actually named the parent image I'm shown here, actually. And that name is then applied to the every photo in that collection. So if I click said grandchild, I can't quickly count those, but all of those pictures will now be marked through the metadata as being of that child by name, right?
So it's using facial recognition then?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, thanks.
And the other kinds, I'm just now looking through, there are some albums, of course, right. Anyone who's used photo software knows you can get an album facility, right? So I can look through, and the first few, they put you on albums you've created first. So I have 1 or 2 albums I've labeled with the name of the city or location mostly. But then, even then, it groups by places, documents, and things. And I don't think I've created any thing title. My things at the moment include a ranch, posters, cliffs, boats, fog, mountains, dunes, if you please, farms, cars, and lakes. That's only the 1 row, actually. When I break it up, I get an awful lot more. No, this is great fun, John. Thanks for asking that one. I can't believe how many groups I've got. And as far as I can see, this is entirely of my photos, right? It's not one of those things where they've imported examples. So you name it, I think there's a category here, and that's a built-in category to Google Photos, by the way. I didn't invent any of these. So, but once you see those, it's a bit like, you know, those horrible Turing test things where you have to click all the boxes with a car in it or something. Well, I mean, I'm looking at cars now, and I'm being reminded of scenes I would never have remembered. For example, there were scenes from the top of Dykes Falls when there was a collection of antique vehicles there, you know, a few months ago. But if you were to browse through the categories, John, it would be very helpful. You need to know to ask, as it were, but you'd be surprised how many things you can ask it. And all that is done for you.
But I'm particularly interested, Harry, in the facial recognition side of things,
right, yes.
because I've just resurrected my family history photographs.
Oh, right.
I've found a whole heap of perhaps 150 photographs from the mid to late 1800s.
Oh, right.
Of relatives that I don't know, obviously.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering if I can trace back from known photographs of the people in their older age, more aged days, trace back to their younger days, and identify these photographs.
Okay. Now, I hope somebody else here has had a go at this one. Obviously, unfortunately, you have first to digitize them if they're hard copies, as whom they are. You may have digitized them already, so you can get them into Google Photos.
They were all photographed.
One might say clearly the Google software is capable of recognizing family resemblances, right? Because that's what it's doing, is deciding whether this resemblance is close enough to be the same person.
Yep.
Right? In much the way that the immigration camera looks at how far apart your eyes are and uses those index characteristics of a face. So whether you've got a beard or not doesn't necessarily matter very much, because it's not looking at that, as far as I know. But whether you can exploit that to look at proximity, John, I don't know. That's a really fun question, as far as I can see. If you knew that two of them were different people and it said they were the same, that would be a very good indication that they were related, at least in terms of facial resemblance. I think it mostly uses faces, by the way. Let me just view all mine again. I think, yeah, the people one, as I said, I apologize for having no pets here, but they're all people. They are human faces. Some of the images are pretty defective, and it's done pretty well. Yes, because what it's done, you see, I've got a screen grab, a row of screen grabs here, and it's found, this was a MelbPC page from somewhere, new to Yammer at melbpc.org.au, and it's found some faces which are actually very low resolution and recognize them as the same. So that's pretty good. So it's clever. It's clever with low resolution pictures. Most of the pictures have a reasonable resolution, John, and it must be able to tell that two faces are reasonably similar. Whether you can exploit that to find family resemblances between people it won't think are identical is a very good question. And if nobody...
John, Harry,
yes,
I can confirm that it actually does go back and categorize people from scanned images and from children all the way up to adults.
Yeah.
And categorize them as the same person. I have photos of my wife's family going back to the 50s and right up to now, and they're all, well, my wife in particular is categorised as the same person all the way up. So I'm really happy with it. And of course, my dogs. They have put the same dog as the same animal all the way through. So I'm really happy with it.
Yeah.
I would-
In the old days of Picasso, they just started to bring in the facial recognition before it disappeared off the market. I ran quite a lot of family photographs through it, and it accumulated an awful lot of photographs of my father-in-law. But we were horrified to find also that his son had been classified as the father-in-law, so he jumped a generation. But generally speaking, it worked very well.
Didn't Google steal Picasso's software?
Yes, I think they did. And that's obviously where they got their
But I
facial
imagine it's
recognition from.
Look, I don't know what goes on behind the scenes. Philip probably has a much better idea. But first of all, yes, they're certainly in an arm wrestle with Apple in this department, aren't they? In the consumer world.
Yeah.
Somewhere back there's an awful lot of money being spent by governments on facial recognition, isn't there? And it may be as innocent as that the researchers, I mean, I used to know one when I was working in facial recognition, happened to work for two different masters, or simply that the skills that are developed in politically and all kinds of other neutral environments before they get applied for all kinds of nefarious purposes. But facial recognition is a very hot thing for all kinds of reasons. And I very much suspect that Google Photos is not at the top of the list in terms of investment. But the actual software tools, because I think a good example actually is your family. If Google Photos had a sequence where you could see the morphing, right? I do believe that, absolutely, I'm not the expert on this, that within certain limits, such as the ratio between the distance between your eyes and the distance between the eyes and the nose changes as you grow up. You know, your eyes do get further apart. And one of the miracles of the eye development is that they stay focused on the same things, even though they change position. But that will be known to the algorithms, because there are other cues as well, aren't there? Like, for example, the quality of the skin, whether it's smooth or wrinkled. So if you get a good succession, say one every decade, it's much easier for the software to see it's the same person than if you take one at the age of 3 and one at the age of 90. That might be a challenge.
Yeah. Harry, I think I've hogged enough of your time with that one. Has anybody else got any other questions?
I'll add a comment. I tried Picasso, probably a decade or so ago, and yes, it did a very good job of matching them up. And what especially impressive, group photos with about 20 or so for people in them that managed to pick out all the faces in those group photos and match them up.
So Richard won't be at all surprised to hear that I was quite impressed with what Google Photos did with a few groups. I could scarcely see who they were, because I'm assuming that it won't have thrown away anything it stole from Picasso. Might have added to it.
Can I share a screen for a second or two?
Help yourself. You're very welcome, John.
There's a sequence. That's about 1874. This is my grandfather. That's him as a perhaps 30-year-old, about 60-year-old, and about close on 80 just before he died. Now that's the sort of sequence that I would expect Google to be able to group for me. I happen to know him, so I was able to trace all those. But there are others in this sequence that I do not know.
Well, sorry. I was going to say, yes, and I suspect that Google is better than we are at that sort of thing.
I hope so.
the eyes are open and closed in different pictures. And you think that makes it harder. But as I said, I believe one of the key parameters for identifying faces is the proportioning of the distance between the eyes to the other key facial features, which are the nose and the mouth, and presumably, if you can get it right, the top of the head, the distance between the eyes and the top of the head. So whether it's bald or not. So those don't change when you close your eyes. So that they look quite different in one respect, but if you because you've told us, John, I could see that they were the same person.
Yeah.
A comment, Harry.
Sure.
On a less pleasant aspect of this photograph recognition,
Yeah.
and while acknowledging that data doesn't exist unless it occupies 2 or preferably 3 places, Google's algorithm looks for something, there's an acronym for it, child abuse or suspicious images or something or other. And you mentioned your grandson.
Yeah.
We have to be careful these days. I hear in a podcast I listen to of photographs of children, taking a bath or frolicking in the backyard.
Oh, yes.
Because if
yeah.
Google decides that they are non-permitted photographs, they will lock your account and essentially lock it forever, in spite of campaigns by the New York Times and the Supreme Court and that sort of thing. Google never responds. So, be careful of what you post just in case, and of course, back up your data.
Which is a good point, and I mentioned, I think, in passing that you can get your, goodness me, I just had another challenge about this. Same or different person with the grandson. Okay. With Google Photos, you can export the lot in one go. In fact, I was encouraging people to use Google, window search to get all the photos together, and because even then, it's perhaps worth sparing a thought for this one. If you're using the desktop, what I'll call the desktop approach, you're not moving photos out of their out of the folders they're in. You're using a search tool that can see into all of them. I think that's an important distinction. And I think we've moved from a world where to find anything at all, you had to put it in a folder you could remember, to a world where the search tools are so powerful that, at least from the point of view of search, what folder they're in doesn't matter at all. And more dramatically, it doesn't matter as long as you've got a cloud service client working as OneDrive and what Dropbox do and others too, but those are the ones I happen to use. It doesn't matter whether the file is in the cloud or on your computer. You can search it, certainly by name. I mean, issues arise about the cloud stores which don't automatically download, but they are indexed, available to Windows. But if you're thinking about backing up, I think it's worth giving a thought to this one. If you want to be sure all your photos are backed up in one place, echoing what the search does for you, you might need to use the trick I mentioned, which is to at least create a buffer folder of everything that you want, which is a photo, and then back that up. I'm afraid this is something that I think everyone here is aware of, but it does certainly cause issues with some of our members. Our data is in so many different places, and some of it's, as it happens, in different drives, or an external drive and internal drive, that's always been there, as it were, but different cloud stores and so on. that it's often difficult to get your head around where something is. Today I was looking for a file and I'd forgotten I'd moved it out of my Dropbox because I haven't got much room there into my OneDrive. I'm using a OneDrive which is in a 1 terabyte OneDrive for files that don't change very much, and Dropbox for files that change a lot. Windows will find them both. I just happen to look in the wrong place. So I think if you're thinking about backup, Peter, yes, if they're in Google Photos, what you do is you do the download and let it happen. It might take many hours, I suppose, with a large Google Photos store now, but then you put it in the whatever you've got on your desktop or wherever you want it to go. If you're doing that, as it were, from Windows, where the files are not in one place, you can, I think, I haven't tried this, I was only playing with this one today to see what you could do. You can select all those files, and I think you can move them in one go onto an external drive without creating a buffer folder. I was suggesting the buffer folder you would need something like the buffer folder to the upload to Google Photos. But it's certainly a good thought, Peter, and thank you for that.
Yeah, so just keep in mind that you could be locked out of your online accounts at any moment. I mean, for the reason I gave and also for other reasons.
Any other observations on the photos issue? Because oddly enough, I wanted to mention briefly another locked out situation that doesn't often come up with iHelp, but it has come up a couple of times in recent weeks. And these were approaches from ex-members who needed to get their email address back because they had used their MelbPC address as an identifier for a non-MelbPC service, in this case, several years ago. The example I came across first was where somebody had used it as an identity confirmation address with Facebook, and they wanted to change their Facebook address. But in order to do that, of course, they had to receive an email at the old address, didn't they? This is perfectly standard with this kind of service. I mean, Facebook isn't right at the top for security, but it has to be pretty close to it in terms of the risks that it takes. So in both cases, we've had to recreate the email address for them for a few days so that they could receive an email at it, so that they could discontinue its use with that particular provider. When I have the chance, when members are leaving or for their own good reasons, absolutely don't want to have a MelbPC email address, or they're not leaving us, I always warn them to be aware who else they might have given the address to, precisely for this reason.
Gary, can I expand on that?
Yes, please.
I'd recommend that they always set up a Gmail address and an Outlook address for that very purpose. Never use even your ISP's address, because that sort of cuts you out from changing to a different ISP for that very reason.
Yes. No, yes. When we were able to, okay, I mean, Outlook.com has been around many, many years. If you go back to Hotmail as well, I deliberately created an Outlook.com account with my same prefix as my personal Google account. And I'll mention a reason why people might think seriously about that particular one. A good friend of mine had a nasty hack a few months ago where somebody had created an Outlook.com account with his prefix. which was controlled, of course, by the third party, and was sending out messages pretending to be him. And that was one of these stings where, you know, people were wanting to get money. So it seems over the top, but there are people out there who may look at list of emails, and effectively our email addresses are public. And this would, I think, probably apply more to your addresses at Gmail or Outlook.com or Yahoo, let's say, than to a private domain address like ours. Because that would be more noticeable apart from anything else. There are some nasty people who will go and grab a free address which has your prefix and then pretend to be you without having to get anywhere near your computer. Just a thought. I mean, I know I can see MelbPC addresses. The prefixes are all shapes and sizes. And we still have, I think, some 3-letter prefixes. I'm not sure we've got any 2-letter prefixes left now. We used to have some in the good old days. But some of them are obviously much harder to imitate than others. So I'm not suggesting you all immediately go home and create a new free account with whichever one you haven't got one in, but it's worth being aware that that does happen out there. Oh yes. While you think of your next question, I'm just looking at my little subset of recent iHelp jobs. It's 9 o'clock, so maybe we ought to stop the formal meeting soon anyway. And my colleague, the presenting problem is Thunderbird locked up. And the solution is Thunderbird freed itself on the 13th reboot. I think that goes to show if at first you don't succeed, then try and try and try and try and try again. Now, I'm not sure who our Master of Ceremonies is at this point, but maybe he or she would like to close the recording now as it's 9 o'clock. It's not my call, but I just thought I'd notice that fact.
Yes, Harry, it's Peter. My same thoughts. It's 9 o'clock, so we might formally close the meeting. And as I said earlier, we'll leave the Zoom running for a while if anyone wishes to have a social chat or talk to Harry. I'm not sure how long it'll go for, but our next meeting is on May the 3rd, Wednesday, May the 3rd. And I'll wish you all good night.
Good night to you, Peter.
I'd like to thank Richard too for the presentation. I'm dumbfounded into silence, but I'm very grateful that it's going on.